Smith. On the faculty of the Department of English at Ryerson University, Toronto, Dale Smith has published 5 books of poetry and a critical monograph, including most recently, Slow Poetry in America, a book of narrative writing. He is author of poetry that investigates the historical and domestic experiences of American culture in 4 other works: American Rambler, The Flood in the Garden, Black Stone, and Susquehanna. Additional writing can be found in anthologies and cultural journals like The Baffler, Best American Poetry, Exquisite Corpse, Mandorla, and the Poetry Foundation website. More recently, his provocative arguments on the concept of slow poetry have been discussed in The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, and other locations of literary and cultural debate. An essay on North American public culture and poetics appears in a new collection, Toward Some Air, Remarks on Poetics. Please welcome Dale.
Provocative. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this book called Slow Poetry in America that came out earlier this year with Kyle Schlesinger's press, who's not here tonight, unfortunately, but his folks were in town, Christmas time stuff, so he couldn't make it. I just saw him. Check out the book, though, if you can. Really happy to be here. It's a beautiful bookstore. So this is a book about memory and place, I think, mostly. This is called Closed Doors. The floorboard of the truck was covered in rough vinyl where I played, scooting from the seat down to the floor and back up, pushing my butt up to the edge and dropping suddenly. I fidgeted on the long drive before anyone bothered with seat belts and pressed my face to the window. Outside, car lights flashed in the approaching dark, and out on the water of Lake Ray Hubbard, red and green boat lights popped like wet gems in the night. Some fishermen moored near the highway with lights still patiently searching through the darkness for perch or crappie or whatever else thrived as slow poetry in America. I look fondly at the blonde head of that child's as his face pressed the glass, hurtling over the lake into East Dallas. In 1970, Billboard named Tammy Wynette Best Female Vocalist. Charlie Pride won a Grammy in 1971. I remember those voices as the emotional textures of time. Not long ago, I found Charlie Rich's greatest hits in a used record shop. His voice stirred nascent longing in my father's Ford. Hey, did you happen to see the most beautiful girl in the world? Headlights of the oncoming traffic aimed toward us and vanished. The black expanse of lake pulled away, and orange streetlights illuminated broken glass and shredded tires on the road's edge. A strip of weed and grass separated concrete from metal guardrail, and the trash of the fields expanded beyond us to the townlets of Rowlett and Rockdale. Charlie Rich's voice promised a magic gateway to beauty, some notion of sexuality I couldn't understand as sex, but felt as some incomprehensible desire. And when we get behind closed doors, arrived to my young body with an urgency of inexperience and half-knowledge, awakening a kind of darkling spirit in me. What was behind those doors? Where did they lead? To the most beautiful girl. The noise of the highway hummed against my ear when I pressed my cheek on the glass. Beyond the glass, the twilight weightlessness of the blue stem outskirts of Dallas feathered away into a dreamy darkness that blurred out against a featureless horizon of orange haze and occasional spotlights. No one knows what goes on behind closed doors. So yes, it's a book. It's a weird book. It's a book about it's poetry. It's sort of a prose space with some verse in it. And I think it's being driven by this notion of how one comes into poetry, as it's such a strange and weird thing to come into in one sense. And in another sense, I think it's part of our inheritance as just being people in the world and paying attention and listening to what motivates us to find out stuff. This is called Drive-In. I remember being stuck at a train crossing in my parents' station wagon on Saturn Road next to a drive-in movie theater. Film violence was enlarged above the motor lanes. Perhaps what I saw was Hell's Angels on Wheels or The Wild Angels, starring Jack Nicholson or Peter Fonda. My mother told me to close my eyes, though I did not. I first saw a naked woman on that screen as she was groped from behind in an act of impassioned embrace that confused me. I pressed my face to the window and looked at bodies expanding across the screen. The train moved its cargo, the rattling and scraping of steel penetrating the field where cars parked, their occupants poised to watch those moving fantasies. Beneath white gravel, the asphalt roadway, black clay compressed, bluegrass blades held to the soil meshed with henbit and chain link. Hairy bittercress and nutsedge stuck to things, unadorned with bits of trash, candy wrappers, and popcorn. So this book in many ways, it's kind of, well, I'm reading, the pieces I'm reading tonight kind of focus on Austin, or sort of Austin's the holy ground of this book in many ways, and then they sort of move on beyond that. And so I just wanted to read a couple more pieces from Austin as holy space. This is called White Heat Light Flat Limestone Glare. Through the windshield, a stretch of Guadalupe thinned out as people lunched at El Patio and Mad Dogs and Les Amis. Parked the car, my thin arms flipped through vinyl records, Record Exchange on the drag, Mita's Murder, Mirror Moves, Stop Making Sense. Slow Poetry in America flashed by, windows down, toward a ledge on the edge of town above the Colorado. My hand on the wheel, twilight and summer gloam. I drank beers with Jennifer, a young woman I once knew. We sat above the city and admired our purchases. The last of the sun vanished behind us. I yammered on about REM as she put her hand on my leg. The closer she got, the more I talked. And then I fiddled with her bra strap and the Slow Poetry in America night of cicadas buzzing in the dusky heat. Jennifer often picked me up to spend evenings at Les Amis, where we would drink carafes of cheap wine, or we'd go to the Varsity to watch Italian movies and afterwards talk about art and cinema in ways that were so new to me then. We talked about politics, too, performing Marxist dogmas that, in a way, seemed so meaningful in the 80s, when a system of signs began tightening under Reagan and Thatcher and their new economy of yuppie mobility. In the Cold War that I remember, we were all encouraged not to think about what happened over there, and that's what gave so many of my generation permission to take seriously what was forbidden here in terms of the circulation of an underground art and poetry. I remember the heat and sweat and June bugs and staying up all night talking with my friends about everything. Slow Poetry in America filtered through our voices, often confused or wrong-headed, though at times, according to our passions, we could be absolutely correct. I remember how Jennifer insisted that I read Jean Baudrillard. I remember that we met in the stacks of the Perry Castaneda Library to argue about Hal Foster's The Anti-Aesthetic and what it meant to be postmodern. Looking all the way back, it's hard to imagine that optimism. There was little money for anything. I worked as a cook in a fast food restaurant. The internet didn't exist. And so we had to figure things out through word of mouth or by reading a book. Books. The coffee shops and taverns around the University of Texas were locations of information exchange. Jennifer encouraged my capacities for learning by not putting down the far-out theories I tried on from time to time. We gave ourselves permission to look at the world and not to be embarrassed or discouraged by what others might find either dangerous or corny. We sat in the heat drinking beer on a limestone ledge, Slow Poetry in America, white stone, juniper, and oak. We watched the suburbs sprawl out over the hill country, looked at cars along the highway jammed by the intensity of commuting those far distances from the outskirts into town and back. I had this one about Rudy's barbecue because I'm hungry for barbecue. I'll skip forward. I've been thinking about barbecue. I was going to read this just to channel some barbecue into my system, but I'll spare it. That's that.
I want to hear the Ruby's barbecue poem.
What?
I want to hear the Ruby's barbecue poem.
You do?
Yeah, I do.
All right, I'll read it for Lisa Moore. Ruby's barbecue. A ceiling fan spun in the humid air on the covered patio at Ruby's Barbecue in Austin. It's for people who don't live here.
Been there.
Across the street, blues from Antone's wailed into the parking lot. I drank a beer under mothy bulbs. Looked back all that way to slow poetry in America. A slim young man in jeans, a white shirt, sneakers, glasses too big for his face. Car lights and orange street lights illuminated Guadalupe Street. Groups of people walked by, laughter, a sudden voice, a phrase, no shit, and then the sounds were reabsorbed into the general commotion of traffic and music. The electric buzzings and squeaky door hinges animated the little patio where I sat with a book by William Carlos Williams. It was not enough to imagine, but to press through against impulse and to experience imagination as both wonder and inquiry. The red wheelbarrow, the delicious plums pressed back on subjective experience, not with objective fact, but conceptual act. Words themselves are not enough, nor the believed certitude of experience. Not even the subjective perception activates the relationship to the object. An abstraction of the relationship is inevitable, although the surface is deceptively plain. Moths fluttered unruly, a loud harmonica pierced the field of automobiles. It is the mystery of the past which monsters, grotesques, beasts combined with the human truly signify, gentle animal associations distorted by the invasion of night, and not a debased instinct whose reliance is necessarily upon oppression and fear. The earth is black and it is there. Only art advances. That's Williams. And what is it to advance truly? Those creatures whose forms left shapes in the limestone walls of the University of Texas, where I studied so many long hours, what advance did those ancient mollusks and clams gain through their transposition into sediment? Ammonites and worm tubes passed through coastal waters that flooded far inland. Oysters and heart urchin possessed active potential in that pre-human slime and damp. See those creatures now time-stamped on Parlin Hall. By their example, E.M. Sioran is right. Any profound impression is voluptuous or funereal, or both at once. Sticky skin, sweat thick on my forehead. Brute facts, the ordinary reality of myself. These were hammered out against a language of excavation and soil. Advance toward awakening, not self as subjective trap, but one who populates the field of a larger attention. I ordered a brisket sandwich and potatoes. Pushed into contradictions, pathways that promised new features of a hidden landscape. I looked back at myself, then exposed as one of those mute moths in the light. Memory can't be trusted, neither can one's optimistic insight to the past, or the past self reimagined in the disorienting drift of prose. What comes to mind can be seen in violation to all that does not. The topic of self, at any rate, can only work as an excuse to dive into the dark and hope the water is deep enough to submerge any egoistic attempt to remember the past, unless there is the pressure of self-critical investigation. And I'll just end with this one little one. This sort of just put kind of traces from Dallas, and a lot of Texas, and then there's a section in Yemen. I lived in the Middle East for a while, and then California, and then we lived here, and this is called Black Walnuts. It ends in Canada, so it's a weird little book. It moves across different North American spaces with a little section in Yemen, and it's really driven by place and trying to imagine a self in those places from and sort of speaking through the self that I imagine I am or was. I don't know. It began just to situate it. There's a quote from Peggy Phelan that opens. It says, "One's own origin is both real and imagined," and that's sort of one of the guiding impulses behind the book. Black Walnuts. There was a bungalow on Higgins Street, and this is a total nostalgic thing I'm doing, but there was a bungalow on Higgins Street in Austin we moved into when our children were born there. Wall painted covers, and I stamped the name Skanky Possum on the little zines we mailed. 11 years in an East Side cul-de-sac, living next door to Fuzzy and Bubba and across the street from Chop Chop and Fairy and Faye, who eyed the boys as they played in hackberry shade and under the slender limbs of desert willow. The many years accumulate and decay with swift urgency. A time to take leave came almost by surprise. The books went into storage. A June fire toasted hot dogs and s'mores, the boys dripping wet from the hose, and a blue plastic pool cooled them in the shade. Low the pecan limbs hang, and black walnuts kissed the barky trunks of them all goodbye, said words like, "So long, my friends," and pressed palms flat against rough skin, and the leaves played light on my face. "Goodbye, dear ones," we said. Anyway, thank you.